You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Monday, everybody. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, presented by BuckeyeGrove.com. I'm your host, Kyle Lamb. 77-31, Ohio State kicking off the 2018 season in style. At least offensively, they kicked it off in style, smashing the Beavers. Dwayne Haskins, what can you say? He was superb. He was excellent. He was nothing short of flawless. Just one interception, and it really wasn't that bad of an interception, but he was nearly perfect outside of that. Even the overthrows just looked amazing. He really looked like the guy that Ohio State fans were excited to see. And, you know, look, it's nothing against Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow had a fantastic debut for LSU Sunday night. Looked really good in the win against Miami. So I think Ohio State would have been fine if Joe Burrow had won the starting job. But just seeing Dwayne Haskins on Saturday, it reminds us why we were in this position, why we were hoping, at least I think most people were hoping that Dwayne Haskins would win the job, and he didn't disappoint. There were some issues on Saturday. Ross Fulton, football analyst of BuckeyeGrove.com, will be along here in just a minute, and he'll help break down some of the more detailed analysis of what went wrong on the defensive side of the ball. There were some snafus, no question. There was a lot to be excited about, though. I think if you really, consider what happened on Saturday with the defense, the domination of the defensive line and some of the injuries that Ohio State had, not being with Jordan Fuller or Marcus Hooker in the back. Tough Borland, of course, making his way back into the rotation. When you consider some of these things, I think Ohio State's defense will be fine, especially with that defensive line. It was every bit as dominant on Saturday as we expected it to be. Nick Bosa was a holy terror. Chase Young looked very good after a couple of the jittery offsides penalties and a couple of mistakes he had. I'm not saying it was a perfect defensive performance for Ohio State. When you give up 31 points to Oregon State, it's certainly not perfect, but I think there's a lot to be excited about. Now, look, we know it's just Oregon State, and a lot of people are going to say, let's slow down. Let's not get too excited about this offense. For as great as it looked, the receivers were getting open and catching the ball, making great plays after the catch. Terry McLaurin looked excellent on Saturday. Dwayne Haskins, like I said, nearly perfect. Mike Weber was amazing. The offensive line, even that left tackle Thayer Munford, absolutely great. But of course, it's just Oregon State. Now, by the same token, if you're going to play the sample size card, and you should, it's just one game out of 12, 13 if you include the Big Ten Championship if they get there, 14 or 15 if you include potential college football playoff appearance. But it is just one game. But you can't just apply it to the offensive side of the ball. People are naturally going to be very critical of the defensive performance. It was frustrating at times. A couple of the same issues that we saw last year rearing its ugly head. The linebacker play against the pass was not very good. I thought Pete Werner was excellent off the edge. Malik Harrison was just okay. Baron Browning, not very good. Some poor tackling, a few missed assignments. Screen passes, they did not defend well. There were some issues, but a couple things here I want to mention, and I said this on Twitter. You can tweet at me at KYLam8. Remember, by the way, we're doing the unscripted mail segment. If you'd like to ask a question for the upcoming Friday podcast, feel free to tweet at me with your question or your comments or anything else. It can be football, basketball related, recruiting related, whatever you want to talk about. Make sure you get your questions in with the hashtag unscripted mail. Tweet at me, KYLam8, and I will attempt to get to as many questions or comments as I can on the Friday podcast. On Friday, by the way, we'll preview the Rutgers game with the publisher of the nightreport.net. That is the rival site, Rutgers site, and that is with Richie Schneiderite, the publisher of the Night Report. So we will preview the game on Friday with him. Anyhow, so it is just one game, but I said this on Twitter. You got to remember, it's more than just, diminishing or contextualizing the success. You also have to think in the reverse. These problems that we saw on Saturday with the defense, the inconsistency, giving up the big plays, the backside of the defense, this is a sample size issue as well. We don't know what the Oregon State offense is going to look like long term. Look, this Oregon State team, they're not going to jump from 1 win to 8 wins overnight. I don't think that's going to happen. This isn't a 10-win football team. It's not a very good Oregon State team, but it could be improved, especially offensively. I think offensively they looked a lot more competent on Saturday than they did last year. This isn't Mike Riley's Oregon State team. Jonathan Smith, I think, is doing great things with that program. I think they're going to get back to being competitive in the near future. But since we don't know what Oregon State is going to be like, you can't just say, well, Kyle, you're being optimistic about some of these issues. I'm not necessarily being optimistic. I'm trying to contextualize this. This game was 14 possessions for Oregon State. The more possessions you have, you're going to have a chance of giving up more points. And, I realize Ohio State did give up too many big plays. That is one of the reasons that there is cause for concern. I'm just trying to say you can't just look at it and say 31 points given up to Oregon State, that's bad. It is, but there's more to it than that. They gave up 2.2 points per possession, which is respectable. Now, for Ohio State standards, it's subpar, but by most people's expectations of what Oregon State should be scoring, it's not as bad as it sounds because of the tempo and the pace allowing for those extra plays and those extra possessions. It's interesting they had 392 yards. 214 of them came on 4 scoring plays, not including the kicked field goal by Rutgers, which, by the way, they started one of those drives down there because of the interception inside the 30-yard line. So that's part of it. But point is, it was really they gashed Ohio State for a few big plays. For the most part, though, they weren't sustaining drives. I think that's important to note. I think the extra possessions are important to note. The 14 possessions is more than all but one game that Ohio State played in 2017. In that season, in the 12 regular season games, 13 if you include Wisconsin, Ohio State actually only had one game of 14 possessions or more. That was 16 by Indiana in the first game of the season. So 14 possessions for Ohio State is a lot. You have to take that into account. When you're giving up 31 points, the more possessions you have, the more opportunities for the other team to score. Even if you have a good defense, more possessions usually is going to wind up being more points over the long haul. So I'm not saying Ohio State's defense had nothing to be concerned about. I'm just saying sample size is a two-directional street. It's not just about downplaying and minimalizing what the offense did against a bad team. It's that even though Oregon State might be a bad team, you also have to take into account it is just one game. I don't see a reason to panic about this defensive performance. There are some issues that I think are going to be a concern, but I don't think there's a reason to panic.
Ross Fulton is here with his whiteboard to break down what the Buckeyes and their opponents are doing on the field. Can't see the whiteboard? Close your eyes and imagine really hard. It's time to go inside the X's and O's with Ross.
Pain heals. Chicks dig scars. Glory lasts forever.
All right, I'm with Ross now, and we're going to jump in and get full steam ahead with football talk. So, Ross, let's start with Ohio State. What were your overall first impressions of outing number 1 for the Buckeyes on Saturday?
I'd say largely good. I thought the offense showed a lot of promise. It was interesting to see how they would adapt to having Dwayne Haskins at quarterback, and I thought that was largely successful and built off what they did last year when Haskins entered against Michigan. I think there's some I thought the offensive line was probably the most pleasant surprise. Conversely, I thought that there's some problem issues on defense that I think issues that could be perhaps minimized and corrected, but that will probably cause some problems for Ohio State throughout the year.
So let's start off on the offensive side of the ball. Dwayne Haskins, man, I mean, I don't think anybody could have envisioned a better debut for Haskins as the starting quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably exceeded my expectations. I mean, I tried to be tempered in terms of someone who's a new starter. I think on the one hand, he benefits from having a very experienced wide receiver group, but nevertheless, his obvious arm strength, his command of the offense, his ability to throw guys open and provide receivers the opportunity for yards after the catch were all immediately evident.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I mean, we're taking into account that Oregon State's defense is probably still, let's just call a spade, junk. I mean, that's probably the case. But at the same time, receivers were getting open. He was hitting them in stride, like you said. He was leading them, had a chance to run after the catch. Just everything about the passing game was in sync, and even the times he overthrew the ball, or overthrew the receivers, I should say, even in his misses, a lot of those were quality, overthrows. They were thrown where if he's going to miss, he missed long, and they were sometimes just out of the stretch of the receivers. I thought he was just pinpoint accurate for a good deal of that game.
Agreed. I think, obviously, caveats about the opponent apply, but to this same extent, the defense was also playing the same opponent who probably isn't going to be a very good offense either and had issues. So, it's all relative. They could have struggled on offense at times, and they didn't. And a lot of that came down to Haskins. They relied a lot on the passing game, particularly on third down. And as you said, he was pretty accurate throughout. Again, he also had the benefit of he was rarely, if ever, pressured, which makes a big difference.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference. I know some people were talking about him not holding onto the ball very long or too long, but it's a lot easier to not hold onto the ball too long when you've got all day to throw. So,
exactly.
Yeah, so he wasn't really in a position where he didn't have to hold onto the ball too long. Your run game wise, it was interesting because Ohio State had 5 rushing touchdowns, and J.K. Dobbins didn't have a single one of them, which is just kind of funny because you would have expected in a game like this, 77 points on the board, you would think Dobbins would have 2 or 3 rushing touchdowns by himself. But the flip side is, it's not that Dobbins looked bad per se, but Mike Weber was just an absolute beast.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think the touchdown thing was a little bit happenstance. There were a couple of drives where Dobbins had been in for the majority, and then Weber came in. But nevertheless, I think that Weber obviously is healthy off his hamstring, and his lateral agility and vision looked much improved. He obviously has a strength. And then, I think you'll see that continue where they rotate. I mean, they have 2 really good running backs, and I think they'll continue to rotate them by series and then sort of lean on the guy with a hot hand, which is a little bit even what they did towards the end of last season as well.
And, it's probably not going to matter in the grand scheme of things for 2018, as, Weber and Dobbins are obviously going to be the guys that are going to be counted on for meaningful game minutes. But it was definitely interesting to see, Snead and Teague both look really, really good as far as the future of Ohio State running backs are concerned.
Yeah, they're both big guys, and I think that, they both showed nice vision and power off the bat. But, I don't think there's too many concerns about the running back room for Ohio State this season.
And we talked a lot about what the offensive line would look like in the first game and this season in general. What were your thoughts? I know you were worried about the left tackle position. How would you grade out that offensive line performance?
I was pretty good. I mean, I thought, as I said, that was probably my biggest concern, and I thought Thayer Munford played well. I thought Malcolm Pridgeon played really well at left guard, especially in the run game. As I said, there was minimal pressure. They consistently opened holes. Jordan looked good at center. There were little snapping issues maybe to clean up, but nevertheless, I thought, that was probably the most pleasant surprise to me in terms of a group with a lot of new guys and question marks that played well, at least in their first outing.
What are your expectations after one game, and we already did the caveat, the Oregon State, not very good defensively, but what do you think? Have you revised your expectations for the offense going forward based on what you saw on Saturday?
I guess I'd say I probably expected them to be probably an offensive-led team anyways. I think probably my expectations were only raised. We'll see how things play out. Sometimes there could be hiccups in the road, but I think it remains to be seen how the offensive line continues to develop. But if they continue to play at that level, I think they're going to be a very difficult offense to defend between Haskins, the two tailbacks, and then receivers who really fit a lot of different roles. It's a group that complements itself well.
Defensively is where the bulk of the conversation is going to be, because we don't really know how to interpret what we saw on Saturday. It obviously was not a very good defensive performance. 31 points given up against Oregon State. Now, I will issue another caveat in that we don't really know what Oregon State's offense is going to look like this year. I think it's probably going to be improved from what they had last year. That doesn't necessarily mean much because they were terrible last year, but I think it will be a better group than what they saw last year. So we don't know how to balance the 31 points, against this Oregon State team. You're giving up to this Oregon State team. We don't know how to balance what that means going forward. But based on what you saw, what were the issues, and what of those issues do you think are correctable going forward?
Yeah, I think, to add to I guess you'd say excuses, if you will, obviously coming off the weird rain delay, and then when they came back, they shut down Nick Bosa and Draymond Jones. So on those two long runs, you had second and third string defensive tackles in the game, which caused some of the issues. And Oregon State had a nice game plan that attacked, some of the tendencies of what Greg Schiano likes to do against, for example, trips formations. But nevertheless, I think there's some big issues in the back seven in terms of experience and really depth. I'd say my biggest takeaway coming out of that game is Jordan Fuller might be the most important player to the Ohio State football team, because safety after him is a gigantic question mark. If you put Fuller back and Borland back, you have two guys who are consistent at taking good angles and leveraging the football, which is probably the biggest problem on Saturday.
Yeah, that was one of the things I've kind of been talking about on Twitter, is that some of the issues we saw, some of the biggest issues we saw Saturday, might be corrected with Jordan Fuller returning, with Tuff Borland returning. Even Marcus Hooker, could improve that. So I think some of those things are very, very correctable just with personnel. And I think, Pete Warner looked great in run support, but, there were a couple times where he was out of position. I think having Tuff Borland there in the middle and maybe moving Browning out to the outside, or, who knows, maybe Browning doesn't even stay in the starting spot when Tuff Borland gets back. But I think the personnel could correct some of these issues that we saw.
Yeah, once you put, Bosa and Jones on the field with Fuller and Borland, obviously that's different than what they were showing in the second half. I think that I agree with you on Warner. He was out of position some, but he also flashed some. To me, I think Malik Harrison is fine. I think he looks improved. I don't think he's going to probably be leaving the field. To me, personally, Baron Brownie was sort of lost out there. I'm not sure if he's quite ready yet. Obviously he has a lot of athleticism, but, my guess would be probably that when Borland returns, you'll see him starting with Warner and Harrison, and maybe Browning gets, some reps, an occasional series. But yeah, I think that would make a big difference.
I thought it was interesting too, all of Oregon State's pass yards out of maybe one or two catches there early in the game, they were almost all from the screens and the short passes. Like they did not have. I mean, the corners in an actual downfield pass game did not get picked on whatsoever. I mean, they had a couple of those pass interference calls on Okuda early in the game, but for the most part, there was no downfield passing by Oregon State. I don't know if that was a lack of opportunity or just the way the game went, but we didn't really see the corners, give up anything downfield.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the corners. I know some people are. I mean, they all played. Okuda's obviously a little bit more inexperienced, and I think they went after him a little bit. But Sheffield and Arnett have played a lot of snaps. They improved a lot last year, and they should both be solved this year. As I said, the bigger issue is probably in the back seven up the middle. I think the screens. I find it kind of frustrating because that was a big problem for Ohio State last year, and they just seem to continue to struggle with it.
Yeah, I think there was a sense, especially after that first one on the second drive of the game, where they went the screen was 60 yards and it set up the eventual touchdown, and I think everybody saw that and it's like, uh-oh, here we go again. It kind of had that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, there's just little things that, to me, like that, or the runs that they gave up, on 3rd and long to end the half that allowed Oregon State to score. They were just was sort of a lack of, I don't know, I wouldn't even say consistency, a little bit of intensity almost at times. And someone just at some point needs to make a play. And it seemed to, again, I think there's a little bit of a leadership vacuum right now without Fuller and Borland on the field.
And do you think, maybe because the offense was having so much success and they were basically scoring at will. I mean, I think that's the best way to say it. Do you think perhaps also the defense was having their way, especially up front with Oregon State? Do you think maybe that lack of focus could have been just a product of the fact that Ohio State was having such an easy go of it offensively? The defense was making a lot of plays at times. Do you think that is all? I mean, it just boils down to something that simple, a lack of focus, and that's what maybe caused some of these big plays?
Maybe a little bit. I think, I just would draw a distinction. I mean, the defensive line is very good. I mean, especially Bosa and Jones. I mean, I think that, and Landers. I mean, I think that, Young and Cooper are a little bit inexperienced, and they kind of had some technique issues in the run game. I just think that the back seven, when the defensive line doesn't control it, they're just apt to give up big plays just from guys being out of position, poor angles. There's a big problem with consistently keeping contained. Those are issues that can be resolved, but it's just a matter of how long it takes to get them to resolve.
I thought it was interesting just, having watched Michigan State on Friday night, having watched Penn State a little bit against Appalachian State on Saturday afternoon, seeing just a little bit of Wisconsin. I didn't see much of that game, but just seeing a little bit of it. And then, of course, Michigan losing to Notre Dame on Saturday night, which we'll get into here in a second. It really does seem to me, I mean, even for Ohio State's problems and some of their issues that they had against Oregon State with giving up the big plays, there is no question that on paper Ohio State looked like the team to beat talent-wise in this league from what we saw in Week 1.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the advanced stats showed going into the season. I think all those teams are good. They all probably played, I don't know if I'd say they played better opponents. It remains to be seen. I mean, Oregon State is a Pac-12 team, so it's not like you're playing an FCS school. But, yeah, I mean, I think Ohio State top to bottom. No one's going to shut people out more or less in this day and age of college football. So, there's going to probably be some big plays, and I think Ohio State will be maybe an offensive-oriented team, at least for a little while. But, yeah, I mean, I think it would be hard-pressed for anyone to say they probably aren't the favorite right now. But Week 1 caveats apply. The old saying goes, the teams get the biggest improvement they make is between Week 1 and Week 2.
Yeah, I think that's a point that we all need to remember is that, and this goes for Ohio State, this goes for everybody, but, Oregon State, for instance, we're all just assuming that Oregon State is terrible because they have been terrible, which is fair. I mean, I don't think they're not gonna magically win 8 games this year. Nobody's expecting that, but we don't know really what Oregon State is going to be. I mean, we have to let them play other games too. We can't just assume that Ohio State looked bad against a team that we thought would be bad, and therefore, well, that's a bad performance. We got to let things play out first. Just like with any of these other games, we don't really know what Oregon State's going to be yet. So, Just a point to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that Oregon State has a good coaching staff now. I think they had, as I said, a nice game plan to respond to the Ohio State defense. So I think they'll probably be in a better position certainly than they were last year.
So we teased Michigan and Notre Dame, and I thought it was interesting because, I mean, basically this Michigan team just you look like you could end 2017 and start 2018, and I saw the same issues in Game 1, albeit against a pretty good Notre Dame team, but the same issues that plagued Michigan last year seem to be the same issues that they could have going forward based on this first game. I mean, the line was terrible, especially the left side, left tackle especially. They did not get any consistent running game going. Shea Patterson looks a little bit better than what they had last year at quarterback, but he's not the savior. So what were your takeaways from this Michigan-Notre Dame game?
Yeah, I mean, the difference from Michigan, ironically, I mean, their defense has been so good, and that they basically had a bad first quarter, and giving up, that was the end because they couldn't score enough to catch back up. I think Shea Patterson's an improvement. I like Karan Higdon as a tailback. The problem is, A, when you can't block, there's so little it can do. And B, they just don't have any explosiveness on offense. It's sort of like dink and dunk a little bit and lethargic. I mean, Higdon's a good runner, but he's more of like a, pick up 4 yards kind of guy. He's not apt to break one. And, again, with Tariq Blackett's injury, that combination, they just don't threaten people very much.
It's really interesting. I mean, that stat that Michigan has not had a touchdown by a wide receiver in 12 games now. That's an insane stat for any team. Like even for somebody like Army, who runs almost exclusively, that would be a crazy stat. But for Michigan, a school with that kind of talent, that kind of prestige, and that kind of conference, that's just unheard of to me.
Yeah, I mean, I read some article that sort of spinning the Black injury is, they got all these tight ends, they can move them out wide to create these mismatches, and I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit because, I'm all for a good tight end, but there's a reason the tight ends line up inside and don't play outside. At some point you got to threaten people down the field, with Tariq Black's injury, they basically have 1.5 wide receivers right now with Donovan Peoples-Jones and Nico Collins, who are both young guys, and they just don't seem to have a lot of ability to get the ball downfield.
I'm curious how you handicap the Big Ten East. Obviously, again, just one game, but what you saw from the first weekend. How would you stack those 4 or 5 teams up? I say 5 if you want to include Maryland in that. I think there's still a clear distinction. Yeah, I was going to say I think there's a clear distinction there. I think Maryland is well behind those other 4, but if you wanted to include them, you could. That's up to you. But how would you break those 4 down from what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, again, first game caveats apply. I think Ohio State's upside is certainly the highest. I mean, I think Ohio State's offense has the ability to be the best unit of any of them. I'd say I still think Michigan's defense is going to keep them in a lot of games. I know they struggled for a quarter and a half and then totally shut down Notre Dame. Their offense they're just going to have to try to win a lot of games ugly. Michigan State, I think, is dangerous because I think Lewerke's pretty good. I think, though, that they again also have some offensive line issues. A lot of what they had to do to win on Friday was go lateral in the fourth quarter. And, I still just think they really like to play a similar style of aggressive defense to Ohio State, and they just don't quite have the athletes in the back seven where if you can throw the ball on them, they can really struggle. And then Penn State, I don't know. I just think they're just missing a little bit, I think, without obviously 2 great players and Barkley and Gesicki. So, Ohio State has to play at Penn State. That's always a very, very difficult game. So I wouldn't, overreact to them struggling with Appalachian State, but I'm just not sure if they can quite so easily replace those kind of guys and a lot of their defense too.
It's interesting for me. I think Michigan, I would put them, believe it or not, even despite Saturday's performance, I would put them probably second in the pecking order, even despite that. But Michigan's problem is that schedule is just so brutal. I mean, they've still got, from the West Division, they've got Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Northwestern coming up on top of the games against Penn State, Michigan State, and Ohio State. So they have a brutal schedule. So even though I would probably put Michigan 2 as far as talent and what kind of team I think they're going to be, that schedule may be as such that, I mean, they could still wind up losing 2, 3, even 4 more games.
Yeah, they're just that left tackle is just going to be such an albatross on them. I mean, they were by the fourth quarter yesterday trying to chip to help him, and he was still whiffing on guys. I mean, Notre Dame has a good defensive front, so they're not going to play people like that every week. But yeah, I agree. I mean, their schedule's tough, and it's just going to be. It's just a lot of it with the Big Ten East is just going to be schedule dependent.
So real quick, Ross, before we wrap up here, so Ohio State a 33-point favorite against Rutgers, and we won't get into the Scarlet Knights right now, but I'm just curious, do you think Ohio State comes out and lays a similar performance they did in Week 1? How do you see that game playing out?
Yeah, I think Rutgers will pose more of a challenge defensively. I'm a big Chris Ash fan. He always has a good game plan for the Ohio State offense. He's obviously pretty familiar with it. Again, I wouldn't think that the Rutgers offense should pose much of a threat, and I don't think they can even probably match some of what Oregon State did. So I would see a little bit lower scoring of a game, but I mean, I don't see necessarily a reason Ohio State can't cover that kind of spread.
Yeah, maybe instead of 77 points, they score 55 points or 51 points or something like that. But
it's been 40. I mean, even I don't see Rutgers posing much of a threat offensively. So it'll be interesting to see if the defense can sort of pull it back together a little bit or clean up some of the issues, I guess I should say.
Ross Fulton, you can catch him on BuckeyeGrove.com and, of course, on Twitter at RossRFulton. I got it right this week. Did not get you mixed up with Mark's Twitter account. But, hey, Ross, I appreciate you breaking this game down and this weekend of football, and we'll catch you next week.
Happy to do it, Kyle. Thanks.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat, the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
So before we wrap the show up today, in the Buckeye Beat, one recruiting note for Ohio State basketball that I did want to mention. E.J. Liddell, talked about this last week, a top 50 wing from Belleville, Illinois, has Ohio State in his top 5, his final 5, along with Missouri, Illinois, Kansas State, and Wisconsin. Liddell visited Ohio State over the weekend officially, along with Alonzo Gaffney, who was a top 30 commitment for Ohio State, as well as top 20 point guard commitment, DJ Carton, who came in unofficially. Those three were together along with the whole team on campus over the weekend. I cannot tell you a whole lot about this other than I've heard the visit did go very, very well for Ohio State. No word yet on whether Liddell is going to pull the trigger and commit to Ohio State, but what I can tell you is I think there's very, very good reason for optimism. He's scheduled to visit Missouri next week. My gut instinct here is that Liddell will probably take that Missouri visit, and I think he's going to decide after that. We'll see what happens. He could wind up taking all 5 visits. He has 3 more scheduled after that to those aforementioned teams. I think Liddell will take the Missouri visit and then call it a day. And if my instinct is correct, we'll likely pick Ohio State over Missouri. Missouri was the longtime favorite here, but Ohio State, under Chris Holtmann, has done a tremendous job really taking the forefront of that recruitment. Liddell would be a great complement to Carton and Gaffney. That would be basically a top 10 class. It'd be a very, very good class. Even though a 3-man class is not the type that you would see be top 3, top 5, it's definitely the type of class that could arrive on campus next year with an Ohio State team that will have a lot back already. And those 3 could really put them back into the forefront of the conversation for a Big Ten title, an NCAA tournament appearance, and who knows, that could be the type of team that could grow into potentially a national title contender. I don't want to put the cart before the horse yet. He's got to commit to Ohio State before we can get into any of that, and that's a long way down the road. I'm not saying that, don't come back and say, Kyle, you said Ohio State is going to win the national title in the 2019-20 season. I'm not saying that, but these 3 are the type of players that could put Ohio State back into that top 10 program place that we were accustomed to seeing when Thad Matta had things rolling at Ohio State from about 2007 till 2013. And that's the kind of place that Ohio State can go with this program with those type of players. So E.J. Liddell's visit is done. It appears to have gone very well for Ohio State. Now we'll see if he takes that visit to Missouri or beyond. But the Buckeyes hoping and waiting for possible good news on that front in the recruiting angle for the Buckeyes. So we'll see what happens there. Reminder, I said Friday, we will preview more of the Ohio State-Rutgers game. Richie Shinnerwright, the publisher of the Night Report, will join us, the Rutgers site on the Rivals Network. We'll get into this game. We'll talk about the pros and cons. Ohio State 33-point favorites. We'll get into the Rutgers perspective, what he thinks from Chris Asher's bunch here in 2018. So Ohio State-Rutgers, we will preview that on Friday. Make sure you get in your mail as well. Hashtag unscripted mail. Tweet at me, KYLam8. Any questions, comments you'd like read on the Friday edition, hit me up with that sometime this week on Twitter. Thanks, everybody, for joining me today. Thanks to Ross Fulton for his excellent recap of the game on Saturday, the 77-31 win over Oregon State. Join me again on Friday. As you know, the Unscripted Ohio podcast every Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com. You can listen to us, follow, subscribe on the archives, iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back at you Friday.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.